Good evening. Hello, hello.
Hi.
How's everybody doing? Great. Good. Wonderful to see you. A lot of familiar faces as well as unfamiliar faces. For those of you who've never met me, my name is Euntaek Kim. I have the privilege of being the co-chair of the piano department at Late School of Music, and I'm so glad that you are able to take part in this rather casual, informal talk. It's sort of a survey of music history in the context of piano music. And I think it is important to emphasize my gratitude for the Linda School of Music for giving me the opportunity to speak, because history is a funny thing, because it depends on who's telling the story. It beckons the question of what is history? Well, the word that we use often is story. I think is the important way of seeing this whole concept, is that it's being told by someone that once was there or heard of something that existed, and just by chance were written down or recorded in some way or form. But of course, with things that are written down or recorded, they tend to get lost. And even if they are written down, sometimes they're deliberately ignored. So when discussing the topic of history, I cannot emphasize enough that this is the version that resides within me. This is a story that is told by my account and my information. So as we take this adventure, it is encouraged that you continue to read and watch upon the subjects that we discussed in this class, so that you can get various accounts of the following story, so that you may get possibly a closer understanding of what we're talking about here. I also would like to thank Shanley Damon for putting flyers up and to send advertisements. I'm very happy to see so many people here on a Friday night. Instead of going somewhere fun, you're here, which for me means that you really love music, or that you really care a lot about history. At least I'm going to assume that. So welcome. And this is how the class will run in general. We'll have performances, and that is the main focus for me in these courses, is that we'll have students or faculty members or whoever that is part of the Lindblad School of Music family to perform works by composers who we discuss here, and to feature the students and to admire their hard work, and to supplement that with contexts, with stories that allow us to understand our composers better. So I wrote some gibberish to discuss for today. Today's sort of an introduction class. Today's sort of a day where we brainstorm together. And that's another thing too, is that you're gonna probably feel perhaps a little uncomfortable about this, but I might call out on individuals within the audience to contribute their opinions as I ask questions, and also to ask questions whenever you have any, so that I may, in my best ability, answer them. So we talked a little bit about how history is a telling of stories of things that happened. Why is that relevant to music? And music, by that I mean we're talking about classical music, right? I'm a classical musician, and not to say that other genres of music don't have their own history, but I'm just choosing to focus on classical music, which of course has the biggest span of history. So why is that relevant for us to discuss? Isn't music wonderful as is? I mean, isn't it just there to enjoy? Any thoughts? Yes.
It might be relevant because if you understand what time the composer is living in, maybe you can understand and play music better.
I think you're on the right track. In what way would that help us?
So that you can give a better mood to the music.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute hypothesis. This is my personal opinion. For me, music is another form of storytelling. The only way in which we're different between history and music is that we're not using language, right? We're using tone. And if music is telling a story, and it's a story written by someone who lived in the past, and if that person is not with us anymore, there's the immediate misfortune that there's a disconnection between us, the modern world, and then the time back then. And here's another thing that we should realize is that even though we say back then, when the composers were alive, it's not back then. It's for them now, right? We're talking about the continuation of now. But obviously is no longer. So we're trying to make the gap go away as much as we can. Will it ever go away? No. I mean, person is gone, and the only way in which we can try to connect the dots is by using accounts, by using general information of what was going on in the world at the time, the society, the country, what have you, and eventually make an educated guess using our imagination to make the gap. So it also beckons the question of how can we empathize with this individual? Should I live in this time period? How would I behave? So in that sense, history is very important in general, isn't it? Because it also allows us to reflect upon how we are to behave in the world that we live in now. So at any rate, returning to music, by doing so, by doing that research, we're able to allow the composer to live again, not to be forgotten, that the composer becomes a living history, so sort of a reincarnation, so to speak. And in doing so, the music lives. So I would like to, for some stuff here, I'd like to play a few things that are written here, and we'll just sort of get a conversation going. I think you will recognize this piece. What is that piece? Yes.
It's the Rondo alla Turca by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart.
Correct. And can anybody tell me who Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was? Yes.
He was a composer that wrote a lot of classical music.
Okay. When did Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart live? We'll talk about this more in detail in other classes. It will be helpful to remember some of these dates, by the way, because it will allow us to understand the flow of time. Mozart was born in 1756 and he died in 1791. He died at the age of 35, which is unfortunate, but it's how it is, which is a long time ago. And another question for you is, Where was Mozart born? Let's say which country? Yes.
Austria
Austria. And Austria is where?
in Germany.
In Europe.
In Europe, near Germany, south of Germany, and
Asia.
east of what is Switzerland. And back in those days, Austria was not the small country it is now, but it was rather cold. Anyone else? Yes,
The Austrian Empire.
right. Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the most powerful empires of Europe. So, what is an Austrian doing writing a Turkish march? That's another question for you. Any thoughts? That is an odd thing to do. I mean, did he go for a little vacation in Turkey? What did he do? Yes.
Did he write? Maybe he wrote the song for the king of Turkey.
Okay, that's a good assumption. How about you, Valencia?
Not sure, maybe he was just into maybe the music from there or the culture from there and was inspired to write that piece.
Okay. How could he have known about that piece, about that culture, since he didn't have YouTube, there was no internet?
Might be from traveling, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Mozart did travel quite a bit in his life, but I don't know if he's ever been to Turkey. And what was Turkey back then, anyway?
Ottoman.
Yes, it was called the Ottoman Empire. So, here's the reason why, as far as I can tell, is that Ottoman Empire was always trying to advance to the European continent, and they were bordering Austrian Empire in the south through Greece, what is now Greece. And so because they were a neighboring country, there was quite a bit of trade. In fact, one of the legend goes that the invention of croissant is from Austria, where they took the concept of the filo dough that is so common in Turkish cuisine, and they turned it into puff pastry, and then to add fun to it, make it into shape of the crescent, which is the flag of the Ottoman Empire, so that they can chew on it. Of course, that is one of the legends that we can't really possibly prove that. But so in Mozart's time, things that were Turkish were very popular because the Turkish army was always trying to advance, and sometimes Austrians would hear the marching bands of Turkey or Ottoman Empire pass by one way or the other. And so that's one thing that you can check out later today in your own time. Go on YouTube and type Janissary music, Ottoman Empire, and you will hear very different, in the more original shape. And so this is how he would have been aware of that, and this is why he's writing it, because it is so popular to write it in Ottoman style. Okay, so how helpful it is to know what's going on in that part of the country at that time, to know why such a popular piece such as Turkish March was written. Okay, now I have here some two pieces, and I'm not going to tell you what these pieces are, but assuming that you've never heard of these pieces before, I'd like you to make an assumption as to when they might have been composed. Okay, here's your first example. And if you can also try to guess who the composer might be. Thoughts? Yes.
I think it was made in like the early 1800s by Chopin.
Okay.
A nocturne.
Okay, a nocturne, early 1800s by Chopin. Anyone else? You're welcome to take part in any of these conversations. This is really a conversation. I don't want to take this into one-man blabbers for 45 minutes. How about you? May I ask your name?
Brandon.
Bren. Yes. How about you?
Maybe it was by Beethoven.
Aha. And what makes you think of?
Because Beethoven was a pretty dark person.
Aha. That's a very good. That's a very, very good point. He was a very dark person. Well, we'll have to see just how dark. And of course, also we have to understand what that means exactly. But and we'll get to it in our class upcoming. So we have here Beethoven, we have Chopin. How many people in this room agree with our lady's point here that it's written by Chopin? Could you raise your hands? Okay. Wait, but you said you were. Well, you said it was written by Beethoven.
I'm not sure.
You're not quite sure. You think it's written by Beethoven, but you're not quite sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. How many people think it's written by Beethoven? That's very funny. All right, so people are just not quite sure. Okay, those who have played some piano music would immediately say, nocturne. There's a Chopin nocturne that we know very well. Or another one. Probably a better example. Therefore, perhaps to hear our example. To assume it's written by Chopin is a very educated guess. But I'm sad to say that Brandon is right. Well done. I was very surprised. You pointed out just so perfectly. This is from the second movement of the fourth piano concerto by Beethoven, which was written in early 1800s. In that case, you're absolutely right. But we don't expect this kind of music coming from Beethoven. All that pedal and freedom and the melancholy that seems to be very tuneful, right? And besides, Chopin was, of course, born in 1810. This was written before that. So, this was written in 1806, if I remember correctly. So, Chopin's nocturnes would not have been written before 1827, 1828. So that means that this music is quite ahead of its time. Music like this wasn't written at the time. And certainly was not written by a man like him. So it's a very special moment. So as a pianist, when one plays this excerpt, that's when one has to go and say, wow, what am I playing here? Is this another moment where we can just create a Chopin-esque mood, or is it something else? What is it exactly? How can we trace this back to the origin, the man himself, Beethoven? And for him to write such a thing, what would that mean? Yeah. So these are the questions that beckon some sort of individual answers, using our, again, imagination. Okay, let's play one more game of guessing. This is a little bit of a long excerpt, so listen very carefully. So, talk to me. Any thoughts? First of all, let's talk about the nature of the music. It's in a minor key, yeah? I'm assuming that everybody has some background in music here, so we can hear that it's in a minor key. It's slow. In fact, it's marked adagio, which in Italian means at ease. When you listen to the music, does it sound tonal or does it sound chromatic, meaning lots of dissonant sounds and confusing tones?
It sounds chromatic.
Sounds chromatic. And you have, that's absolutely right. When you have things like that's quite chromatic. And when we listen to chromatic music, do we associate a certain time period in general, or
The Renaissance?
the Renaissance? That's interesting. Okay. Anybody else? Normally, when we think of chromatic music, we think of times when people were a little bit more experimental with sound. So in that sense, the reason why I said Renaissance is because I'm actually quite fascinated. You must have done quite a few music history lessons or readings. Because the High Renaissance, at the very end of Renaissance period, which unfortunately we won't be covering in this class, things got very dissonant, to a point where music wouldn't be as dissonant again until about 1870s. So we're talking about music that was written around 1590 was as chromatic and dissonant as that of the 1870s and 1880s. So, interesting, right? History just never, it doesn't mean that humans are always developing in a linear upward motion. It's going in this motion, and we'll cover that as we go through our class. You'll find that we humans just can't seem to make up our minds about style. So I'm quite fascinated by it. But normally when you hear such chromatic music, people would assume late Romantic period, meaning after 1870s, or even more likely modern period, which is in the early 1900s. Right? You have music like, what would be a good example for that? You have pieces by Schoenberg, which is often written in 12 tone, which is often in very dissonant tones that don't really agree, tones that really, I'm kind of improvising at the moment, notes that don't really belong in diatonic music. But here, this music seems to sort of go along with that. Very carefully, you realize this. Something is very weird about this music. So people would usually assume, it must be written in the modern period. But one would be wrong about that. This was written by Johann Sebastian Bach, who lived between 1685 and 1750. This is the 25th variation of the Goldberg variations, which was written I believe in the 1720s. So that means that this music is 300 years old, which is something that we don't expect also. Music during this time, of course, was much simpler. You had people like Antonio Vivaldi writing the Four Seasons only about 10, 20 years before that. So then one has to ask the question, what's wrong with Bach? What's going on with this guy to be writing such crazy music? There are so many questions that one must ask in order to understand music in such a way so that our eventual goal, I hope, is to have the attitude that we wrote it ourselves, so that the music is coming from us. Right? It's not that we're looking at some page and we're trying to wait for it to always tell us what to do. Of course, at first we do that, but we absorb what is written in the text, the only link to the past from that composer's hand to ours, and then we bring it into us so that it comes out in this living form. And that's the process of performing art. It's sort of the same way with acting, right? If you look at actors doing Shakespeare's Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet or King Lear, what you're going through is exactly the same process. How do you bring back words that were dead 400 years ago? Right? And this is, of course, under the great assumption, which I think is a fair assumption, that humans back then could also feel emotions as we do, which is obvious. So, any questions so far? Next week, or rather next class, which will be in 2 weeks' time, we'll be delving right into the Baroque period, which is roughly between 1600 and 1750. And we'll be featuring specifically composers such as Bach and Scarlatti. I chose these composers because they are perhaps the most significant composers for keyboard music. But that is not to say that there aren't any other composers during that time period. We're, of course, skipping over a lot of things, and we don't have very much time generally to discuss the complexity of these lives and of these periods. We're skipping over, for instance, George Frederick Handel, who was in fact more influential than Bach ever could dream of in his time. We're skipping over the great French masters such as François Couperin and Jean-Philippe Rameau, who were Rameau particularly is the man that completed what we call the diatonic harmony. The things which you learn when you take music theory, the concept of 4-part harmony and triads and so on and so forth. It was really Rameau's treatise on harmony that completed that. In fact, so much so that I believe, if it's not currently true, until very recently, the first year doctoral students at Juilliard School are required to read that treatise. Many of my colleagues who took those classes begrudgingly tell me. So, but unfortunately we have to skip over them because even though they did write keyboard music, it is not played as much as they need to be. Baroque music, we sort of randomly draw the line at 1600s, although Baroque music really should be divided into two periods as well. And what differentiates Renaissance with Baroque music was, I think, and this is a personal opinion, is the birth of opera. What is an opera? Can somebody tell me what opera is?
They're singing a story that's not English.
Well, could it be in English?
It could.
It certainly could. For instance, there was a Baroque composer, again, an important one whom we will skip, named Henry Purcell, who was an Englishman, who wrote great operas in English. So it could be any language. In fact, it was a language of your land, but most often written in Italy, in Italian. Now, why is that? Because opera was invented in Italy. Because of that, the tradition began where Italian was preferred language. But it wasn't always so. Germans wrote their own versions of opera. Some of them were known as Singspiel, which means sing play, song play. So the birth of that took place sometime around 1600s. It was, I believe, one of the very first instances of commission of an opera took place because there was a wedding by the Medici family. Does everybody know who the Medici family was in Italy?
I think they were Italian noblemen.
Correct. There were powerful Italian noblemen in Florence who started their banking business, and it was one of the first international banking business. Kings and princes would borrow money to attack each other. And the Medici family would then lend them money and take the money back in interest. And they were so powerful after doing some of this banking for some time that they had their own army. And so they basically took over the entire city of Florence. And so I hope that you will have the great pleasure of visiting Florence, Italy, and see many great buildings built there, beautiful buildings built by under the surveillance of the Medici family, and they were great benefactors of art. Some of whom, whose name you might have heard of, Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, benefited from them. Raffaello, same thing. Michelangelo, all these people received money and protection from the Medici family. So, when a princess of Medici family was being married off to another nobleman somewhere, in I believe it was Genoa, they commissioned a play that was to be sung. And this was such a success and such a great show of power by the Medici family that it became a popular thing to do. And because you might assume that opera is a very complicated production, there had to be a great deal of renovation that took place in music writing. And a man who lived in a town up north called Cremona by the name of Monteverdi came up with a treatise that says New Style of Music. I'm paraphrasing, of course, where he first discussed music in terms of vertical collections of tones rather than to think of them as horizontal sounds. We call this horizontal way of thinking of music as contrapuntal music, which means several voices clashing with each other. But there were tendencies that people were used to, and Monteverdi simply said, these are the tendencies, which is what we now call chords. And thus began the concept of figured bass, which is something that I won't go into very deeply, but it's to have a certain bass line and come up with their version of basically a chord chart, so that you could find what chords to play above that. And this new way of thinking simplified a lot of things, and all the complicated writing of the high Renaissance style, as a result, became abandoned for the importance of drama of the opera. Okay, so the first 50 years or so of Baroque era music wasn't so much focused on instrumental music. It was focused on vocal music. And so there isn't very much keyboard music that survived within repertoire. I don't mean that there isn't any music written during that time for keyboard. In fact, there's a ton of it, but we don't play them really because it's still sort of the continuation of the Renaissance. But it eventually develops into what we are familiar with, which really starts from 1700. So really we're starting our class from 1700 and on. And as you might see, all throughout the 300-year period from 1700 up to, let's say even up to 2000, it's really about opera and orchestral power that supports the opera, which is then transferred onto piano. So we'll discuss more of that thoroughly as our class goes. One thing that I might suggest for all of you before you come to the next class is to do a little reading on what happened in the Western European continent between 1700 and 1750. Just a general idea. Of course, when I was a student, this was frowned upon, but Wikipedia is a perfectly okay option. Just some reading is better than no reading, so that you get a general idea of it. And you will find certain important events that might have taken place during that time that changed the society a little bit. It certainly will be the case with the early classical period. That beckons the question, perhaps we can end our class on this one question, which is, and I'm going to ask it contemporaneously, meaning talking about now. We've gone through some interesting time, all of us. Yeah, we have still some people who are choosing to use masks, which is perfectly fine because we just went through a hellish period, that's the coronavirus. One must then ask the question, how do these major events in life affect us personally? And with that question, one must also ask the question of these individual composers, how much do they get influenced by what's going on in their lives outside? Let's just let that sit for a while. Let's think about what our last 3 years meant. How that, yes.
Oh, I was waving at her. I'm sorry.
Certainly things change. I mean, financially speaking, of course, things change. You will find as we journey through the 300-year period that there's a lot of war. European continent is riddled with war. How do they respond in people's minds individually? Since you will do a little bit of reading about 1700 to 1750 or early Baroque period also, you'll find that in Germany, which is where Bach was born, they were going through some serious civil war, which really stunted the German growth of culture and economy. Not to mention that the country was completely fragmented. The concept of Germany as a whole, one nation, didn't exist. Every city practically hated each other. It was a nation within. How does that respond to an individual? What does that feel like when you have to travel 10 miles with a passport? How does that affect you? So these are the questions that I want you to think about for the next 2 weeks before we begin our talk about Bach. Okay, so with that, do we have any questions in class about what's going to happen? If any of you play the piano, by the way, and would like to play something written by Bach or Scarlatti, if you're working on it, please let me know. You can email Dr. Vogel and let her know, and she'll let me know. You're more than welcome to perform. Again, like I said, the performance is the center, and the history is the background, and I'd like to discuss it in that manner. Assuming that there's no question, we'll call it a day. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you in next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.